Good morning, all. Yeah. Right. All right, we think we're ready. It's another one of those messages that God has changed, thank you, Lord, as I've been getting closer to it, and taking a lot of actual stuff out and adding stuff in that's more to do with kind of testimony. It's really strange. So if you're looking for a message here that is a detailed analysis, of breaking down a scriptural passage, intellectual, this isn't today. And already I kind of feel a little bit of a fraud, because the main issue that I want to deal with, I suppose, is evangelism. And I'm not an evangelist. Well, at least not in the sense that the modern church sees evangelism. They seem, the 21st century church seems to see evangelists as a separate breed. They're the kind of church's hitmen. And they've got these great testimonies and they're great communicators. But more than the other thing, they seem to be entertainers, performers. And they'll put you on a good show, which is safe to invite the unbeliever to, because that's the purpose of it. And at the end of it, you've got the altar call, you'll have the head count and the response cards, and off they go, job done. And in that sense, that's not me. But of course, in another sense, we're all called to be evangelists. If evangelism is preaching the gospel with an intention to persuade and to point people towards Jesus, well, that's our calling. 2 Timothy 4, I think, says, amongst other things, do the work of an evangelist. So I suppose when I'm using the word evangelism here, if I do, what I'm talking about is a wider thing than that. I'm talking about witnessing, testimony, getting out and sharing our faith. And in that respect, the only thing that gives me the kind of credibility to actually stand here and talk about evangelism is the fact that at least once a week we do that. We go into prison. Liz and I and John and a lovely lady called Anne from the Salvation Army Church in Burnley, we go into the world of the unbeliever, because there's no point in us all saying, yeah, we've all desired this heart for evangelism because that's our responsibility. If the only time we ever share our faith and witness is in the comfort of church and other Christians. If you've got a heart for evangelism, for sharing your faith, we need to place ourselves into the world of the unbeliever. But when we go into prison, I don't actually go in as a hit squad. We drink coffee, we talk to people, we share stuff. Effectively, we're kind of building relationships, but with God at the center of it. We're sharing our faith within that kind of context. But sometimes, of course, it's necessary to look at a Bible story. And of all the stories that we use that connect with guys in prison, remember that the majority of people that we're connecting with in prison are drug addicts, guys who are there because of some kind of link with addiction. The story that connects most with them is the story in Mark chapter 5, where Jesus meets the man who was demon-possessed. Now, that story connects with guys in prison in a major way, because a lot of guys will try and connect with us by saying, we're Christians, and they'll say, well, I was brought up in the Catholic Church, or I used to go to church, and so on. They'll try and make some connection. But when you talk to them, you realize that they've never actually met or understood Jesus. They've got this kind of church generalized stereotype view that here is this nice guy with long hair and a beard and a kind of white nightie and open-toed sandals floating around saying bless you and doing nice things and saying wise things and that stuff, like a good teacher. That's the idea they've got. But the Jesus of Mark chapter 5 presents them with a Jesus who is hugely, hugely compelling. And that's really what I want to look at in part this morning. I'm going to rush through it because there's some stuff I want to say off the back of it that we'll see how that goes down. But I want to look briefly at that story, so I'm going to put that up in a moment. But if you've got a Bible, you can turn to Mark chapter 5. But the background to Mark chapter 5, of course, is in back end of Mark chapter 4. And we discover then that what Jesus is doing is preaching down the west side of the Sea of Galilee in Jewish areas like Capernaum. And according to the reports, they're having tremendous success, what the church would regard as evangelistic success. Big crowds, big meetings, enthusiasm, lots of responses. And I dare say if we were one of the disciples, we'd be loving it. We'd be thinking, oh, this is what we signed up for, isn't it? This is brilliant, that. Look at this. Every seat filled, big meetings and so on. But one evening, Jesus says to the disciples, get in the boat, let's leave the crowds, we're going to the other side of the lake. Now I imagine if I was one of those disciples, particularly someone like Peter who's a bit mouthy, isn't he? I would go along to Jesus and say, hang on, why? Hang on, Jesus, why would we go to the other side of the lake? Look at all these people, they love us here. This is success. Now why would we, come on, you know what's over there. We fish this lake. It's an area called the Gadarenes. And it's not a Jewish area, it's a Gentile area of pig farmers. Come on, they're not going to love us over there. Why would we leave this here to go over there? But that's what Jesus tells them to do. And it's important to remember that if we desire a heart for evangelism, that sometimes God may ask us to put down, to leave behind the things that we associate with our own personal success, our ministry, the things that people identify us with, the things where we get all our credibility and our affirmation from, to come out of our comfort zone and head towards enemy territory. And we know what happens halfway across, don't we? There's a big storm, blows up, and even the seasoned fishermen amongst the disciples think that, wait a minute, we've not seen anything like this. This is going to kill us. And so they wake Jesus up, and Jesus calms the storm. He rebukes the storm. So it seems like even going across into enemy territory, we encounter opposition. Now, this is basic stuff. This is not the stuff that really grabs the guys in prison. But they understand this, that Jesus was prepared to leave success, to go through problems, to go through opposition, to get to the other side. But what really grabs these guys is what they find on the other side of the lake. They don't find a horde of people standing there saying, oh, thank you so much for coming over, Jesus. We've been waiting for somebody to come from the other side to give us a message of hope. They don't get that. They find one guy. They find one demon-possessed guy who's not given a name. But all the addicts that we deal with in prison will tell you exactly who he is. They'll even tell you his name. Because most mornings they get up, they look in the mirror, and there he is staring back at them. Because they know it's them. So let's just look at him, can we? This is what it says. Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 5. They went across the lake to the region of the Gadarenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an evil spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he'd often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills he would cry out and cut himself with stones. This is the guy they go all that way across to meet. And these guys recognize exactly who he is, that he went all the way across that just for them. See, this guy is demon-possessed. Let's look at him. He's demon-possessed. Now, I don't give a lot of credibility to demons. I think there's more things to credit with our own choices than blaming everything on demons. We went through that in the 90s where, deliverance ministry was this kind of big thing, and you couldn't light up a cigarette at a Christian camp without half a dozen Christians jumping on you and trying to cast out demons of nicotine and all that. So, but the fact is that this guy was demon-possessed. And however these things got into his world, they had a net result was the fact that they controlled him. And any addict will tell you exactly what it's like to be controlled. To have something that's got into your world, that you brought into your world, that has you in its grip, that you feel powerless over, that even as we see after this, it actually talks for you. It talks in your voice. They'll know exactly what it's like to be controlled. But you don't have to be an addict to be controlled, do you? You can be controlled by all sorts of things. Fears, insecurities, relationships, desire for money, low self-esteem. So many things can control us. So I think the impact of this guy is more than just, here is somebody that addicts identify with in prison. This guy is something much wider than that, and I'm going to call him this. I'm going to call him a poster child. We know what a poster child is, don't we? The charities use it, the starving kid in Africa. And the appeal of the poster child, because it's trying to engage our hearts, is the fact that we know that this is a bigger problem. It's not just this child, there's 100,000, there's 1 million of these starving kids. But what it does is make that problem personal, that face. And this kid is a poster child. And I think he's a poster child for what it's like to live in a world separated from God. This is the unbeliever. This is the person who, if we've got a desire for evangelism, our hearts are drawn towards. Let's just look at him. And we know he was controlled. And if one thing else, sin controls us. There's a whole world out there of unbelievers that is controlled, that is in the grip of sin. But there's more to it than that. This kid lived in tombs. In his world, nothing good grew. He lived amongst death. And there's a lot of people out there. Do you ever meet them? Do you ever see these people? Just going through the motions of life, where the life has gone out of them. Do you see people like this who have gone without hope? Just struggling day after day to go through. Living, but somehow dead. And also, what was controlling him had separated him from all the relationships he was entitled to. We're born for relationships. We're created for relationships. But this guy's living up in the tombs, and down at the lakeside are his friends, his family, and so on. Sin separates you. Certainly addiction separates you from the ones that, guys in prison separate from the ones that they love. You should be there Christmas morning when these guys are running down the wing to get on the phone to connect with the kids who are opening their presents at home, that what they've got into their life has separated them from. But in a wider sense, the whole world out there is separated from the relationship we were created from. True? That relationship with God. That loving relationship with God. They don't know it. No wonder people chase after relationships in an attempt to find something fulfilling. They live amongst the dead. They're separated. And there's one detail in Luke's gospel that's not in this one that says that the kid was also naked. What was controlling him had stripped him of his dignity. And sin can do that as well. Addicts will tell you that. How addiction strips you of your dignity. Nothing dignified about waking up with a cracked den, in a cracked den with a needle in your groin. Nothing dignified about the things that addiction makes you do. But then there's nothing dignified about kids out on the razzle on a Friday night, getting blind drunk, throwing up in the gutter. There's nothing dignified about the drunk. There's nothing dignified about these poor people who turn up on the Jeremy Kyle show week after week to expose this kind of shallow relationships. These abusive relationships. Oh yeah, he knocks me about. He doesn't look after the kids and he runs off with other women, but I love him. He's my world. Nothing dignified about that stuff. About people's shallowness, people's emptiness. And what's more, the world would have you believe that this shallowness, the world in which they live is a kind of temporary thing. Oh yeah, it's a bit of a grind, but I'll be all right once I've had a holiday. Well, no, you won't. You come back from the holiday, and pretty soon, within days, you've forgotten you ever went. You're back into the grind again. It's a 24/7 experience, and so was it for this kid. Day and night, among the tombs, he cried out. There was no respite for this kid from this lifestyle that these demons, what was controlling him, had drawn him into. Can you see what's happening here? And another thing about this kid is he cut himself. He was a self-harmer. And there's a lot of self-harming in prisons, a lot of self-harming in schools and institutions, various ways in which you can self-harm. The kid is a self-harmer. So we sell this to these guys. We paint this picture to them. There's Jesus standing there. And a few paces away is this poster child for a lost world. Now something's got to happen. There's Jesus who came to give us life in all its fullness, which we could call, if you like, the fruits of the Spirit. That would be a good summary of it. Galatians 5:22-23. Let's remind ourselves of those. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It's what should grow in your world when you're connected to God and you allow him with cooperation and your choices and his power, and you offer him the fruitful soil of your heart. That's what should grow in our world. And here's this kid who has none of it. In fact, when I was looking at this, I read an article on the internet that was about a psychologist who dealt with people who self-harmed. And he said he'd identified key emotions that lay behind people's desire to cut themselves. And he listed them, and there happened to be 9 of them, so I thought, come on, it's a gift. I'll use that. 9 fruits of the Spirit, and 9 things that you could call the poison of self-harm. These are the list of this guy's emotions that lie behind this. Look at this lot. Self-hatred, despair, fear, shame, depression, unhappiness, guilt, anger, and helplessness. Now tell me honestly, when you look at the world that you live in out there, when you look at the newspapers, when you watch the telly, when you talk to people, do you see a lot of love, joy, peace, self-control out there? Because I don't. But I see an awful lot of despair, of shame, of guilt, of helplessness and fear. Liz will remember this guy, Michael of Michael and the Clipboard in prison, who looked at that list when we put it on the table, cut out pieces of card, and he looked at that list on the right and he said, that's me. Every single one of them. That's me. And that list on the left, I know none of them. See, Michael recognized he was that demoniac. And that Jesus crossed the lake for him. It's one of the joys, actually, of going into prison. When people start to make this connection, what we sang about this morning, this divine exchange, and you suddenly see somebody coming in the next week and they're lit up and they say, some of those things on that right, they're starting to lift off me. It's the first time that I've been able to deal with this and I'm starting to find peace, and then for the first time in my life, and you see this exchange. It's one of the things that keeps us going. And if you ask Liz later about our mate Kevin, 45 years in addiction, now 9 years clean, and a wonderful Christian. He had all that list on the right. Now, effectively, he's not a finished article, but he's got so much of that on the left. Wonderful. See, can you see how compelling this is to an unbeliever? Not just a guy in prison, but to an unbeliever. That Jesus would leave all this and come across the lake for someone like that. It's hugely compelling. But now we've got this meeting. We've got Jesus who came to give us life in all its fullness, and a kid who has none of it. And the heart of Jesus goes out to this kid, and the heart of Jesus can do many things, but there's one thing it cannot do, and that's nothing. The heart of Jesus must act. And we know what happens. Jesus sets him free. The demons are cast into the herd of pigs. The pigs go into the lake. And the next time we see this kid, we see it in verse 15. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there dressed and in his right mind. That's what God wants. No some great angels dancing on the duvet experience. Some sort of exciting stuff. What do you want? Dressed, dignity restored, and back in your right mind. And we know what happens in the end of the story, don't we? Verses 18 to 20. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And all the people were amazed. Natural reaction, isn't it? You've been set free. Take me back to the other side of the lake. Let me be sort of part of this nice little group that you've got there, this excitement the guys have been telling me about. But Jesus says no, not because you're not worthy, but because there's another job for you. Go back to your family and tell them what God has done for you, how God has had mercy on you. But what happens to this guy is he goes back, but then what's happened to him is so big that it bursts out of him and he has to take it further. He goes into the Decapolis, the 10 cities of the region. Because it's too big to be contained. He wants to find other poster kids like himself with scarred arms to show them the scars on his arms that are now healed. And apparently he does a great job because the people are amazed. So I hope you get the idea that this is a powerful picture to present, particularly to guys in prison or in the world of the unbeliever. They see it as immensely powerful. They say, if that was Jesus, if I could believe in that Jesus, I'd buy that, I'd have that. Because that's irresistible. Jesus there is irresistible. He'll come, put down success, come through problems just for me, and not only that, set me free, but give me a plan and a purpose for my life, turn the mess of my life into a message of hope for others. Oh, they'll have that. And when we take that message into the world of the unbeliever, when we cross the lake and we take that same message with the same agenda and the same heart, it's equally irresistible. And that's important. But there's something that makes this story even more compelling to the guys in prison, and I think to others. And that's what's missing. You know, there's something missing from all that story. Something that guys certainly have come to expect in evangelistic encounters with Christians. And it's this. Where's the bit where Jesus stands before this kid and says, look at you. You're a mess. Dirty, scruffy, smelly, cut to ribbons. You're an embarrassment to your friends and your family and to yourself. You need to take a closer look at your life, mate, and realize that it's a complete and utter shambles. Where's that bit? Where's the bit where he calls Peter and John to do a bit of testimony? Come on, Peter, come on, John, stand next to me. See, these guys used to be ordinary like you. Now look at them. Hair neatly trimmed, beards cut, underarm deodorant, fresh underpants on. They look the business, don't they? Part of a movement that's changing things. But this one used to be just an ordinary fisherman. Soon he'll be walking on water and preaching to thousands. This one will be writing books that will change the history of humanity. See, they used to be just like you. Now they're here, living the dream. And all you've got to do is respond. John will pray with you. Peter will fill in your response card with you. Job done. Where's that bit? See, it's not there. What's missing from this encounter is very simple. Where's the bit where Jesus points the finger at them? What's really missing is where is Jesus' judgmentalism? Well, it's not there, and I'm very, very glad it's not there, because I've learned one thing in the 10 years we've been going into prison, that judgmentalism will kill your evangelism stone dead. It kills it dead. And I know that, and Liz will tell you this, check it with her. Before I went into prison, I was one of the most judgmental Christians around, certainly with regard to people in prison. I had no sympathy with them. I didn't want to go into prison. Why would I do things like that? I'm a teacher. I pay my taxes. I work. These guys, costing £35,000 of taxpayers' money every year for this lot in prison, and for that they get 3 meals, colour telly, pool table, all that sort of stuff. I had no sympathy whatsoever with them, because I was better than them. See, my Capernaum, my west side of the lake, my comfort zone were kids. Put me in a room with a load of teenagers, I'll talk about God, I've got no problem at all. But my Gadarenes were adults. I don't talk to adults. I'm wary about adults. I get embarrassed talking to adults, particularly men. And particularly this sort of men, the sort of men you find in prison, they were out of my comfort zone. So when somebody came into my world and said, I think it would be good if you came into prison with us, I said yes straight away, because I knew it had to be God. It had to be God. Nobody else would require me to go from Capernaum to the Gadarenes, out of my comfort zone. Only God would expect me to cross the lake. So I'm sitting there in Lancaster Castle with my knees knocking and my heart pounding, waiting for these monsters to come up into the chapel, expecting these huge guys with tattoos and scars, knuckles dragging the floor, and I thought they'd come in, they'd look at me and they'd say, could see the fear in his eyes, we'll have him. Instead, a little fella came in his 30s, and he came across, shook my hand, said, thank you so much for coming in, we really appreciate it. You really don't know what this means to us. He sat down, he said, my name's Thomas, I was a heroin addict when I was 13. That was his opening line. And within minutes, we're talking like long-lost friends, catching up on past times. He's telling me about his family, I'm telling him about my odd parents. He's telling me about getting into heroin. I'm telling him about my alcoholism. And I'm thinking, I don't talk to people about this. I'm a teacher. I don't go into the staff room and tell people this kind of stuff. You know, I've got an image to protect. I cover it all up. You know, I've got a career. I've got to kind of live up to this image in front of kids and staff and management. But here I am talking about this, and I discovered in the course of those 2 hours and various meetings with Thomas and the other guys, the therapeutic value of being honest for the first time. The therapeutic value of taking stuff that's going on in your world and bringing it out there. And we've kind of been discovering that in the 10 years ever since. That God has progressively, in those 10 years, knocked every lump of judgmentalism out of me, because I've recognized that judgmentalism will kill your evangelism stone dead. It will. The minute that you point the finger at an unbeliever and you say that I'm right, you're wrong, you're effectively saying you need to be more like me. You're placing yourself above people, and they stop listening. They might sit there nodding, but they're not listening. You could tell them black is black and white is white. They're no longer listening to you, because you placed yourself up there and looking down. So I've learned that when you start to lecture somebody, they stop listening. Now, by the way, there's a big difference before anybody sort of picks us up on it and say, well, that doesn't mean we never criticize anybody. No, there's a big difference between pointing the finger, judging, and challenging. I'll come to that in a minute. But I learned about pointing the finger. I didn't learn it from a scripture. I actually learned it from Dire Straits, who were my favorite rock group at the time. And they did an album early on called Making Movies. And there's a song on it called Solid Rock. And Mark Knopfler writes these lines. It says, when you point your finger because your plans fell through, you've got 3 more fingers pointing back at you. Now, it's not an original idea, I'm sure, but it was the first time I'd heard it. And it connected with me, and I thought, that's clever, isn't it? Because you can't, yeah, that's right. You can't point a finger without 3 times as many fingers pointing back at you, and there they are, 1, 2, 3. You can't do it. So there's a lesson there, isn't there? If we look at ourselves at least 3 times more we look at other people, we'll learn A, more about ourselves, and B, connect with those people better, because we won't be putting ourselves above them. And the other thing about pointing the finger, I've learned also, is you can't point a finger without also making a fist. And there it is. And that's no way to go into the world of the unbeliever, no matter what sort of heart we've got, is it? Or go into other people's lives, pointing the finger and making a fist. Well, that is not going to go down well. Jesus doesn't do that with a demoniac. He offers a hand, and you can't point a finger while you're offering somebody your hand. I suppose the best example of that in Scripture is the one that we know, isn't it? It's the woman caught in adultery. And I'll put that, a little bit of that, up. But remember, the situation here is the religious people have brought this woman who's been caught in the act of adultery before Jesus, and they say, Lord of Moses says we should stone her to death. What do you say? Now, they're trying to catch him out. Jesus says this. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, if any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who had heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. John 8, verse 7 to 11. Now, by the way, I know there's much more to this than a simple matter of Jesus going in front of these guys and saying, come on, we all make mistakes. And these guys saying, yeah, we never thought of that. Good point, Jesus. And then you walk off. There's much more to it than that. But there's a principle here that's crystal clear, that Jesus deals first with those people judging, then with the woman. And there's a lesson there. If you're pointing the finger, please go away. You're clouding the issue here. He deals with the people judging first, then with the problem. Judgmentalism kills it. And I suppose if there was anybody in the whole scenario who had a right to point a finger, any kind of right to point, it would be Jesus. And if he chooses not to judge, why do we? But the church does. Guys will tell you that. I no longer go to church because I went to church, I felt condemned and judged. How sad is that? See, there is a difference, and I'll say this about challenging and pointing the finger? Does this mean that we never challenge anybody? We never tell them about hell? We never tell them about their wrongdoers? Of course it doesn't. Plenty of examples in the Bible where we have to do that. But there's a difference between challenging and pointing the finger, and that difference, in my opinion, is all about motive. What's the motive behind it? See, I'm interested in this as a kind of looking at human beings that we met in prison. I'm interested in people. And what's the motive of the people involved in this? We know the motive of the religious people, don't we? They're trying to catch him out. But what about the people with rocks in their hands? What about them? What was their motive? And from our understanding of people in prison, for example, I'll tell you what I think it is. That pointing the finger makes you feel better about yourself. We see it in prison all the time. Guys are in prison because they've done something they know is wrong. They've been judged for it, and they're there in prison. But my goodness, they will always find somebody else to point a finger at. I may have done that, but he's done this. They're always pointing the finger to other people. Always needs somebody else to look down on, because pointing the finger makes you feel good at yourself. While I'm bouncing rocks off this woman's head, I will feel good about myself. See how holy I am. That's why it offends me. It makes you feel good about yourself. The other thing it does, of course, is to deflect attention away from yourself. Because while I'm pointing the finger at this person, the guys in prison do this a lot. While they're pointing the finger at somebody, he's doing this. We're not looking at them anymore. Oh, I wouldn't do a thing like that. That's the point they're making. They deflect attention away from themselves. It's all very cunning. And when you're pointing the finger at somebody who's doing something you think is worse than yourself, people are no longer looking at you, so you're kind of getting away with it. There are motives to this. That's what turns it from being challenging into being judgmental. I'm not sure I should mention this, but I'm going to anyway. There was a little group, local church, hardcore church, a few years ago in the neighbourhood. I'm not going to mention the name, but they used to go to Accrington Town Centre with placards and a megaphone on a Saturday morning, and they used to tell people that they were going to hell. That was their message. They'd stand there with this megaphone going, you know, you're going to burn, you're going to hell, you need to repent, and all this kind of stuff. That was their message, you're going to burn. And the dynamics when you watch it was hysterical, because the whole precinct emptied. And people no longer crossed it. They would walk all the way around the edge of it to get to the other side of it. Nobody dared cross that square, because they'd have her with the megaphone. You in the grey coat, woman, you're going to burn. Do you know that? You need to... all this. And it was great. Yeah. Trouble is, people, at the end of the day, they packed up and they went back feeling really great about themselves. I know they did, because I talked to them. I mean, you used to know some of them socially. They felt great. Even the fact that people would not look at them, they felt brilliant. They would say things like, do you see? They couldn't make eye contact with them, because the unholy them could not make eye contact with the holy us. See, that's it. Now, what was their motive? Was it challenging? Was it judgmental? Because all they would say is, well, we're required to do that. Tell them you're going to go to hell. Otherwise, they're not going to know. We're just challenging them. But what was their motive? I don't want to judge them either, but I did speak to them, so I know they said stuff like this. Were they weeping for the lost, like Jesus did over Jerusalem? Did they weep? Was their heart breaking for the lost? I don't think it was. When I talked to them, they'd say things like, well, if they ignore us and they choose to go to hell, their choice. Serves them right. Let them go, see if I care. And that's the phrase that gets it, isn't it? If they go to hell, see if I care. Well, we should care. We should care until it breaks our hearts and we're prepared to cross the lake. I had a little example. I know what it's like to try and feel good about yourself. They used to ask me to go into Haslington High School when I taught there into the sixth form, into an RE lesson, because they had a little module called, in the RE course called, it was something like, you know, conversion experience. It was a gift. I would go in, do my testimony and get paid for it. It was fantastic. And I went in, and it was in the aftermath of 9/11 and suicide bombings in Israel. And there was a little group of Muslim kids. And they said, sir, so we don't agree with what these guys did. I think that was totally wrong, sir. We're not supporting that. But at least admit that they cared about something. They believed in something. Even if they were wrong, they cared passionately in a world that doesn't really care. They cared about something. They were prepared to die for your faith. And one of these kids put his hand up and said, sir, would you die for your faith? Well, red rag to a bull, wouldn't it? Of course I would. I would die for my faith. Wouldn't put a bomb to myself. That's ridiculous. And I spent 5 minutes telling him how big and tough I was, how I would die for my faith. I couldn't be moved. I would stand on this principle. People could put a gun to my head and I wouldn't deny Jesus. All this stuff because I wanted to feel good about me. And at the end of that lesson, I went back to the staff room feeling really good. Stood up for you there, God, didn't I? And I went into the staff room waiting for the lunch bell, and God slapped me. He said, how dare you open your mouth without thinking what you're saying? Why would I ask you to die for your faith? And he said this, dying for your faith is easy. It's living for it that's hard. And it is, isn't it? Nothing tricky about dying for your faith. You strap a bomb to yourself, put yourself amongst the unbelievers who you don't care about, blow yourself to smithereens. Particularly if you think that gives you an automatic ticket into paradise. That's not bravery, that's just selfishness. Much harder to get up and forgive them, and to love them, and to go in their world and try and reach them. Much harder to live for your faith. Dying for it's simple. And that's not decrying Christian martyrs. The big thing about some of the Christian martyrs that we admire is they die for their faith, but they live for it first. They did both. So this is not a soft liberal message about anything goes. Don't criticize anybody in case they get upset. There's plenty of examples in the Bible of people being criticized and challenged. But what is the motive? What is the spirit behind it? And secondly, have you earned the right to speak into people's worlds? Have you earned the right? And that doesn't mean are you perfect, because none of us would ever have that right. But in 10 years, we've earned the right to speak into guys' worlds in prison, and they know it. Because we come in every week and Christmas morning as well. They know it. We've earned the right. So we challenge them. And they accept it because they know the motive. You've crossed the lake. You've put down success. You're prepared to go through the problems, to talk to them so they believe you. That's my problem with these guys in Ackley, I suppose, in the town centre. They haven't earned the right. They weren't there the previous day. They're not going to be there the next day. They just come in on Saturday morning, tell people they're going to hell, and then they're off. Have you earned the right? Have you got the credibility to speak into somebody's world? See, I'd pose those guys in Accrington Town Centre. If somebody had gone up to them, go into somebody's world and say you're going to go to hell, people might turn and say, well, who are you? I don't know anything about you. What are you like behind closed doors? What's your life like? And it's a good question. See, living the Christian life is hard, isn't it? Have you tried it? Really living it? It's tough. I mean, I had an instant conversion, 6 o'clock Good Friday, 1988. And Guy was talking, because it was Good Friday, about what Jesus did on the cross. So I got this idea of justification, being made right with God. I got that straight away. That was what it was all about. What I hadn't got was sanctification, this idea that we've sung this morning about being holy, getting right. There is stuff, there is a way of life I've got to live. And it was almost like, somebody put it to me this way, it's almost like God gives you a box when you become a Christian of all these things he's got a problem with. You're forgiven for them. You're not going to change things. But, there's stuff you've got to deal with. He says, I'd rather you dealt with that, because that will bring you closer to me. That will honor me. And there's a load of stuff in that box. My goodness, Jamie, there's a load of stuff in that box to deal with. He's got a problem with a lot of things. He's got a problem with homosexuality. He's got a problem with adultery. He's got a problem with promiscuity. He's got a problem with pornography. He's got a problem with drunkenness. Lying, stealing, cheating, false witness, all this kind of stuff. He's even got a problem with gossip. There's lots of things in there to deal with. So I tell you what, I am very pleased when there's something in that box that I don't have to deal with because it's not a part of my life. So I don't have to deal with the homosexuality one because I'm not gay. And I'm glad about that, because it frees me up a bit to deal with some of the other stuff. So I've got better things to do than to rummage in somebody else's box to find out what they've got. Oh, you've got the homosexuality one in there, have you? Oh, that's a baddie. Let me quote you a scripture on that. That will send you to hell. I've got better things to do with that, because A, it's making me feel better about myself. You're having to deal with something that I don't. And B, it's distracting me from actually dealing with the stuff that I should be doing, which is in my box. So, I haven't earned the right to do that in people's lives. We have in prison. And if anybody, and that's by the way, if somebody sees in me, from what I'm saying today, or what you've seen over the past year, 18 months we've been in the church and so on, something in me that entitles me to speak into your world, of course I'll do that. I'll help you, I'll pray with you, whatever. But I'm not just going to charging into somebody's world like a bull in a china shop and say, you're doing this. Because I've not earned the right to do that. And it's important that. See, it would be simple for me, wouldn't it, to condemn Christians who drink, who get drunk, because I'm a teetotaler. 15 years since I last had a drink. So I could point the finger. Except, of course, 16 years ago I was an alcoholic, so it's a bit harder to point the finger then. But the fact that I've dealt with that has not given me the right then to start pointing the finger at people who are still struggling with the thing that I struggled with, but have dealt with. I can help them. And God uses that in prison, actually. He uses that quite a lot. Because when people talk about their addiction, you can say, yeah, well, I used to be an alcoholic. Not to lecture them, but to come down to a level playing field where I can say, well, I know what it's like, and let me tell you what God has done for me in that area. And that helps. If I ever went in and said, I used to have a drinking problem, but I've dealt with it, and so you need to do that, they stop listening. We use our mess as part of the message, but we don't point the finger. So God uses even my alcoholism in order to reach and connect with people. And that brings us to the conclusion, really, doesn't it? Brings us to the conclusion, which I guess is back to the demoniac. So let's put him back on the screen. The end of that story, verses 18 to 20. What Jesus says to this guy is, go to your family and tell them what God has done for you. And he goes further and goes to the Decapolis and tells those people what Jesus has done for him. Jesus doesn't say, go and tell them what they need to do. Tell them the good stuff that God has done for you, not the bad stuff they've done for themselves. So he goes in to tell them the only thing he could possibly tell them, what God has done for him. Because that's all he's got. Of course we preach the gospel, and good teaching is important in circumstances, but sometimes when we go out and evangelize, witness, share, whatever we're calling it, all we ultimately have is us. That's all this kid had. That's all he had. He didn't have a story of what he'd done. He hadn't done anything. He just got up one morning expecting the day to go the same as all the others, except this day was different because Jesus came into his world. And one touch from the king changed everything. So he had nothing to tell him. So actually this gives me I dare not say this, I'm going to say it anyway, Jamie. I'm going to set you some homework. It's okay. Okay, I'm a teacher, former teacher, I'm going to set you some homework. It's not a written homework, it's all right. I've gone past the days when I'm going to mark essays, but stuff like that. But it's just a challenge to you, really, a homework to think about. It's one of these kind of things we used to do in English. Imagine you are. Imagine you come with us on Thursday into the prison. And we're on a one-to-one time. And you've got a guy sitting next to you or in front of you. And he's not a believer. But because you've crossed the lake and come into his world and got his attention that way, he's prepared to listen to you. He's open-minded. And he simply turns to you and says, well, okay, you used to be a non-believer. Now you're a believer. You used to be a non-believer just like me. Now you believe. Well, look, can you tell me, very simply, what has God done for you? What would you say? There's your homework. What would you say? See, you can't really go on about hell too much, because the guy says he'll listen, but he may say, well, I'm not quite sure I'm there yet on that. I don't really quite get that. I think it might be a Christian scare tactic, so I'm thinking about that one. And you can't quote the Bible too much at him, because he'll say, well, I'm not even there yet. I think that possibly, the Bible's been altered. I'm not convinced. So in fact, all you've got is the same things that the demoniac had. You. What has God done for you? See, if we don't have an answer to that question, we're struggling, aren't we? What has God done for you? See, that was all the demoniac had to tell them. And that's all that we've got as well, in so many occasions. But if we get it right, and we've got an answer to that question, you never know. The people will listen, and they might be amazed. God bless you, Jamie.